In this video, we're going to do some hard modeling with Fusion 360 Forms. Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and in this video we're going to continue on with our Fusion 360 Forms mastery, but now we're going to talk about hard modeling. Now, hard modeling is traditionally thought of when you're using a polymodeling program like Blender and you're creating more parametric or hard edge objects. So in Fusion 360, obviously we have CAD tools, we have solid and surface tools, and these are generally going to be the best fit. Now, we've already done a series on modeling a rotiform rim using those tools, and you can check it out here. But what I want to talk about is ways in which we can kind of do the same thing using the form tools. Now, the first thing we're going to do is start a new form, and we have to ask ourselves, why would we want to do this? Well, in some cases, very organic shapes are harder for us to control or create with our traditional CAD tools. And that's why things like organic shaped rims are going to be a little bit easier for us to do with the form tools, potentially. But let's go ahead and jump in. And full disclosure, I haven't modeled this rim before. I don't have an idea in my head. We're just going to progress through the steps to understand how we could go about this, and we'll just see what it turns out as. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to start with a sketch. I'm going to do this on, in this case, I want the rim to be visible from the right plane, which means I'm going to sketch this on the top plane. We're going to begin with a line. I'm going to start at the origin, go out to the right, hit OK. I'm going to come up vertically, hit OK, and then I'm going to draw a horizontal line and hit Escape. We want to use a midpoint constraint between this line and here. And then we'll hit Escape, select these two reference lines, and let's go ahead and make them construction. Before I go any further, I'm going to change my units to inch. And typically that would kick us out of the sketch, but recently that's actually been able to stay inside of the sketch in Fusion, which is really great if you forget to change your units at the start. Next, we're going to use dimension tools, selecting our midpoint or the axis of revolution, then selecting our horizontal edge. We're going to right click, turn it into a diameter, and I'm going to make a 15-inch rim. I know it's relatively small in terms of new vehicles, but 15-inch rim is going to be fine. Again, we're just playing with the concepts. Next, I want to determine how wide the middle section of my rim is going to be. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make it 4 inches. And then I'm going to use my line tool to create sort of a dish or a tapered edge here. And then I'm going to come up where we're going to have a connection between our rim. And then I'm going to come up where we've got the lip for the bead. And in the back side, I'm just going to come up to that position and go straight up. Then I'm going to add some constraints. I'm going to make these points horizontal. I'm going to make these ones horizontal. And then I'm going to add some dimensions. So we'll make this section here 1/2 inch. We are going to put that vertex 2 inches above our 15. So this actually will end up making like a 20-inch rim. Again, it's fine. It doesn't really matter. We're just looking at technique here. And I'm going to put that back lip 3.75 back from the midline. I'm going to put this front lip 5 inches from the front. And then we need to sort of determine how big these sections are. So I want to right click and say aligned. And I'm going to make the spoke or the intersection with the rim 1 inch. And then I'm going to determine its angle. Now, we don't have to go through all this trouble of fully defining this just for an exercise that we're going to be doing, but it is always a good idea for us to think about these. Now, you might be wondering why with this sketch I didn't add any fillets or I didn't round any of the corners. Well, when we're talking about hard modeling in Fusion 360 Forms, creasing edges is likely going to be the best option. And if we have a sketch like this, when we go to create and revolve, it's automatically going to add creases in those sharp corners. When I select my axis of revolution, you can see here that we've got those creased edges. This is going to be much easier for us to get started. It looks a lot more like the box display, and it's going to help us really progress. So now we have to determine how many faces we want, and this is actually a tricky part. So let's think about this. When we view this from the front, all the green lines are my symmetry lines because I turned on circular symmetry. When we think about circular symmetry, we have to determine the number of faces that we have in all directions. So if we rotate this around, if I increase this number here to 10, you can see that it's increasing the number of faces from front to back. If I reduce it to 6, you can see some of the faces In this case, this front face only has a single division, really. It's going from the front to the back of this edge. So when we think about the number of lines that we drew in that sketch, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. 6 is going to give us the most accurate, precise, flat faces between all of these divisions. So that's a good tip that I want to make sure that we understand is if we're using straight lines and we're drawing something like this, try to make the number of faces that you have equal to the number of straight lines you drew. If I double this, then you notice that we're going to start dividing everything up, and not all the faces will be divided. It's based on size. So the lips are still sort of single faces, but you'll notice that this front starts to get divided up and the rest gets divided up. So again, we can add edges later. It's better for us to have less now than more. The next thing that we need to determine is this value, the number of faces. And if we say 5 here, notice that we're reducing the overall number of faces. If we went to 15, notice that we're adding more divisions. We have 5 inside of each of these symmetry lines. And it's also important for us to keep in mind that these numbers should be divisible by each other. So I'm not going to say 16, which is going to be an awkward number, and it's going to mess up our symmetry faces. So in this example, I'm going to say 10. This will allow me to grab 3 faces from the inside of the symmetry and begin to build out a spoke. And you can take a look at the symmetry faces. We have it set to 5, and you'll notice that that gives us all of these different divisions. If we increase or decrease this, if we say 10, you can see that we've got more divisions inside of those faces. 5 is going to be enough for what we do. We could actually go down further and say 3, and that gives us one large section in the center that we could extrude. It kind of just depends on what your intent is and how many spokes you want on your design, what kind of shape you're looking for. If you wanted to go with something like a 5-spoke design, you can reduce the number of faces, and you can see that we've got 1, there's 1 underneath this here, 2, 3, 4, and 5 symmetry lines, which means that if we move this face, the other 4 matching faces will move. To keep this as simple as possible, let's go ahead and use these numbers. We've got 6 for the faces that are going front to back in the x-axis. We've got 5 for the faces that are going radially, and then we've got 3 for the number of symmetric faces. From here, let's say okay. Another benefit of the number of faces or divisions is now when we look at this, we've got one that's perfectly lined up with one of our axes. If we were using an even number like 6 or 8, this would be a little bit easier. But when we use 5, we're only going to have one situation where this is in line, which means that when we're using edit form, moving in the X, Y, or Z axes is going to be easier if we're manipulating this section here. So as we're looking at this design, we need to also have a center section, a place where we want to attach to. So once again, I'm going to go to my right-hand view. I'm going to create a cylinder this time at the origin, and we're simply going to drag this out and click, then manipulate some of these numbers. We're going to use 5 for the diameter. I'm going to rotate this around. The number of edges in this direction don't really matter for me, so I'm going to reduce that to 1, clean it up a little bit. But the diameter faces are going to be important, because the diameter faces are going to determine our symmetry and our ability to connect to our other geometry. So let's turn on circular and notice that the symmetric faces right now are 1. We're going to try to replicate what we did 3. And the number of diameter faces, in this case, we want to make sure that we have enough that we can actually manipulate and connect to our geometry. So if I set the diameter faces at 5, we want to make sure that our symmetry lines match up. And it's going to be kind of hard to see from a straight-on view, so you have to rotate it just a little bit. This green line matches up here, this green line here, this one here, and you can see that this one that one's harder to see. This one goes straight down here, and this one goes over. So this gives us a situation where we have enough faces, enough geometry that we can attach to. We can say okay. The next step in the process is to determine where this lies, where our mounting flange is going to be. I think where it sits is actually pretty good. If you want, you can go to inspect and create a section analysis inside of forms. These are just surfaces, but we can still sort of cut it away and take a look at that. So that looks pretty good. I'm going to hide the analysis folder. I'm going to double click this front edge, go to a right-hand view, and use modify edit form. Now, this is important. We are going to extrude this out using scale, but we want to make sure that we extrude it out with a creased edge. So that's Alt and Control on a PC, or Command or Option and Command on a Mac. So we're going to begin scaling this out. I'm just going to go out a little bit, let go of those, and I'm going to do this one more time. I'm going to hold down just Alt in this case and pull it out, and then rotate this around. And then I'm going to hold down Alt and Control again on a PC, and then I'm going to pull this back. So what we're doing is we're sort of building out that flange. I don't really care that this is open right now. I don't know what this shape is going to look like. I just need something to attach to. So again, this is sort of my starting point. Let's go ahead and say OK. Now, when we think about the way in which rims are made, certain features like the lug holes, those are really best added later on. We would need way too many edges to control those details. So we're not going to consider or worry about those. We only want to worry about connecting the spokes from this outer ring to this inner ring. And when we do that, we can think about things like whether or not we want a crease here. We're going from a creased edge to a creased edge, but we might not want that to be the case. The next thing that we want to consider is how we're going to go about doing this. Are we going to manually extrude down here? Are we going to bridge? Are we going to use some sort of shape? And these are all different things that we need to determine. For me, what I want to do is I want to create another sketch. This time it's going to be on the top. I'm going to use slice in my sketch, and I need to find the position in this sketch where I'm sort of in between symmetry lines. You can kind of see the green line over here in the positive y direction, and it's not here in the negative y direction. That means that the negative y direction down here is where we're going to be extruding or bridging from. So what I want to do is I want to create a curve that represents the shape that I want. I'm going to do this with a spline, and I'm going to go from here to here, and I'm going to say OK. And then I want to try to use Create, Project, Include, and Intersect. See if I can intersect a face. So you'll notice that it won't let me select faces, but I can select the edges. So I'm going to select these edges, and this is going to give me a vertex reference. So from the top, going to use my line tool, which is L on the keyboard, and I'm going to just draw lines between these two, hit escape, and then turn those into construction. I like to use X on the keyboard. It's quicker than coming over here. And in general, when you're trying to build out your own workflow, it's always a good idea to use shortcut keys if you're comfortable with them. So when we have shortcut keys, it just speeds up the process and it keeps us from having to drag the mouse all the way up here. Or if you get used to using the right-click marking menu, or the S key, which is the shortcuts, and this is contextual. So this is sketch shortcuts. We can add to it by searching. So for example, if I say S and I start to type in spline, if I could actually type spline, you can see here that we can insert T-spline, we can have a fit point spline, and we can do a control point spline. And we can simply put those up onto our shortcut palette, or we can remove them whenever we need to. So it's a good idea to get used to that workflow. For me, for the number of years that I've been doing this, when I am training, I try to avoid shortcut keys, which means that I've sort of gotten used to just going to the location where all the tools are. But in a professional sense, when I was designing products for customers, the efficiency of using just the S key, for example, so that the mouse doesn't have to go all the way up to the toolbar and it can just be wherever the mouse is, that is a much quicker workflow because that S key will bring up that shortcut wherever you are. So just a quick tip there. Next, I'm going to simply adjust this curve. At this point, I'm not worried about the exact shape because obviously with forms, we can manipulate this as much as we want. I just need to get a starting shape. And if I try to bridge from here to here, it's going to fail because a straight line from here is going to sort of cause a pinch. It might overlap and it's going to cause a pinch. So we just want to kind of get it away. Now that we have that in place, let's go to Modify and Bridge. I'm going to select this face as side 1 and this face as side 2. We want to make sure that these points are in the same location. So this point and the direction of that arrow is on this lower inside edge, and that's the one that's going to attach to this point. So that looks pretty good. Then we want to use Follow Curve. Follow Curve will help us get that shape. Turn on the preview, and you can also see that the symmetry. We've got symmetry everywhere. It looks pretty good. So with the preview, there's a couple things that we need to think about. The number of faces that we want here is going to control the divisions. If we reduce this to 1, it can't follow that curve. It just goes straight. If we put 2 in there, it's going to get pretty close. In this case, 3 is probably going to get us as close as we can without adding too many extra controls. Another thing that we want to consider is this maintain creased edges. Maintain creased edges will keep a crease at both sides of this bridge, this intersection. So remember that it's going to remove the faces that we selected, and then the crease is going to make sure that we keep that sharp edge. And because the inside and outside lip on the rim portion is already creased, and this back edge is already creased, this is probably a good way for us to progress. So let's say okay and take a look at the results. So that was pretty quick to make that shape. This is a good time for us to go into box display mode, which again is Alt and 1 on the keyboard. You can also go to display mode here and just take a look at the results. Everything looks pretty good so far. When we go back to smooth display mode, you can see that these shapes are very gradual, they're very smooth, and the way that it blends into the rest of the design is probably not what we were expecting to see. But if we go to modify and crease, and we crease these edges where it enters the design, and we crease these edges, and make sure that the back one stays creased, we'll say okay. And now you can see that we've got a little bit different result. Now, in an ideal world, this is not a great result because now it's starting to push and pinch this outer section of the rim. If that's the design intent, that's perfectly fine. But we should continue either uncreasing everything or potentially crease the upper and lower edges of the shape. And that way, when we crease those, it looks a little bit more like our box display. Now, it causes problems up here, but the rest of this geometry is okay. If we go back into box display, now you can see that box display and smooth display look very, very similar. We've got a pretty good interaction between those. At this stage, the same rules are going to apply. You want to shoot for 4-sided faces. You want to avoid star points where we have 5 edges coming into the same vertex. And we want to avoid triangles. Now, again, that's not universally true because we can't avoid those in every design. And in fact, almost all designs will have a triangle somewhere and will have a star point somewhere. But if we can avoid those in any design, we'll get a much cleaner result and it'll be easier for us to control. So at this stage in the rim, remember I mentioned I did not pre-model this. We're going through the process together. This is sort of an exploration of these tools. And now at this stage, I want to figure out how I potentially want to change this design. The first thing that I want to do is I want to try uncreasing this upper edge. So I'm going to go to modify and I'm going to select uncrease. And I want to uncrease everywhere that this intersects with the rest of the body and say okay, and just take a look at what this looks like. So that doesn't look too bad. We've got this flat lip section and now these carry down into the rim. One thing I will say is I'm not extremely happy with the way that this intersects with the rim. So I might consider double clicking on this loop and trying to delete it and trying to delete this edge and letting it blend in, which means that we need to uncrease these sides. So if we go to modify and uncrease, we can uncrease that side and this side, say okay. And now you can see that we're blending that shape in. Now remember we did crease this edge. If we want to maintain a tight transition on that edge, it's best that we do either insert edge or we add a bevel to it. We will need to add an edge back here to control that or potentially carry a ring around the middle of this because right now this edge right here, the short edge, is causing us a problem. But we can also play around with deleting those and we'll have to go to the other side and delete it as well. And then now you can see that it blends in a little bit better. Now, in reality, what we would end up doing is we would cut the lug hole through the center of this. So I'm going to carry on. I'm going to continue uncreasing edges. So I'm going to select all of these. I'm going to try modify and uncrease. I'm going to say okay. And now you can see that it's blending in a little bit better. I still don't really like these creased edges ending in a smooth edge. In my designs, I try to avoid that because I'm not really happy with the way that we can control the crease because it's either on or off in Fusion 360. Unlike other programs or other polymodeling programs or subdivided modeler add-ons for CAD packages, in some cases you will get an edge weight control. We could say that we want 0 down here and maybe 25% here and 90% here, but we don't really get that same level of control here. So we have to do it by inserting edges. So let's start by double clicking, go to modify and insert edge. I'm going to try to do a both, and I'm going to add a small value 0.05. And notice that this does not carry up into the lip. It's only doing it on this one section right here. So it's already not working how we'd expect, but let's say okay, and let's see what it looks like. You can see that it breaks. It doesn't allow us to go into smooth display. So we're going to do a Control Z, undo. I'm going to double click this edge and I'm going to uncrease it for this example. And I'm going to do the same thing under here. I want to uncrease this and carry it all the way down to the rim and say okay. So the smoother result looks okay, and now I want to try to add that additional control back in. So again, we're going to have to do it individually because it's not treating this as a loop. And if it doesn't treat it as a loop, then it's not able to actually go in and create that insert edge. So when we select something and we double click on it, that's going to allow us to get that geometry. For this example, let's go back to single. And let's place it on the inside. And the reason I want to go on the inside is because on the outside, it would likely treat this entire thing around the outside as a loop. So I'm going to insert a single right there. I'm going to repeat the process here. It's on the wrong side, so I'm going to say minus 0.05 and OK. And you'll notice now if I try to go back into box display mode, I've got that small lip that's added here. If I rotate this around, I've got the small lip that's added here. It carries all the way down to the center, but it doesn't carry down to the bottom, which means that in order to keep the curves and everything happy, I need to put one in here. And if it's on the wrong side, again, because the preview doesn't tend to work right now, we're going to make sure that that value is just positive. And that does not look like a good result. So what I want to do is go to modify, insert point. I know that down here it seems about right. And up here, I'm going to manually create that edge. Then I'll select the one that's at a sort of a funky angle and delete it. We'll try again over here, modify, insert edge. I'm going to go minus 0.05, put it on the other side. And again, it doesn't look right. So we go to insert point. We'll come from here to here, straight line. Then we'll select the one it created at the angle and just delete it. So everything's looking pretty good there. We could potentially pull these up a little bit and manipulate the shape. But now we need to connect it here. We need to move it around and connect it. So I'm going to try to insert an edge. And in this case, it's on the wrong side graphically, but I know that the first preview is a positive value. So I'm going to leave negative 0.05 and say OK. And you can see that, again, it sort of blends into this corner. It does not look right, but it gave us the offset we want right here in the middle, which means that I can go to insert point. I can come from here. I want to make sure that I select that point, and then I delete this one. And keep in mind, I'm still in box display mode. I haven't switched back between smooth display because honestly, that's just going to cause some worry. It's not going to look right. The way that these edges are flowing is going to just raise your blood pressure a little bit. So now that we've added all those on the inside, because we're dealing with symmetry, in this case circular symmetry, we only had to do it on the inside of these two spokes. You'll also notice that it doesn't appear that there's an edge here. So that instantly is sort of a red flag for me. So I'm going to go to insert point. I want to come from here to there, say OK, and do the same thing over here, here to there, and say OK. Now let's go into smooth display and see what we've done. Okay, it looks like we still have a crease under here. Let's go to uncrease, get rid of that. Now that looks a whole lot better. So it took a little bit of work, but let's step back and let's take a look at what we've done. There's a crease on the inside. I think I want to get rid of that as well. So I'm going to uncrease that. And usually the creases that we add are sort of a placeholder. Now, they're not intended to be a final solution in most cases. And I always do say, make sure that you're comfortable working in box display mode. Box display mode is really going to be the best avenue going forward at really understanding clean geometry, clean patches and clean faces. I know I call them patches all the time. They're just faces, but in this case, it's a good way for you to progress in your modeling and understand the symmetry between all the underlying geometry. If we switch between the sort of control frame display, so not box display and not smooth, we can see the curvature that we're creating in box display mode, these edges, and then we can see how that translates underneath. We've got the smooth edge here, and you can see it on the surface. We've got this edge here, and we can see it on the surface. And everything looks pretty good. I'm really happy with those results. We could do the same thing with the bottom edge, and we could add an additional offset and then carry it around. But I think this is a pretty good result. Now, from here, you also might want to make some additional adjustments. And what I would say is make sure that when you're using edit form, that you try to use things like scale to make sure that everything's moving in the correct direction. So we want to scale everything. We want to move in a single direction. And then once we're happy with those results, Alt and Control, and I'm going to extrude down. So you can see that that looks pretty good. Everything here, you can see that because we did that bridge, it opened the spoke up. So this would be, a hollow spoke design. We could certainly fill that in and patch it up. And the way that we would do it is we would build the intersection of the rim. We potentially thicken it, delete those inside faces, and then build it from there. Now, if you're going to do that workflow, it's always a good idea to offset it or thicken it before you add the spokes. And that's because if you thicken in forms, it's going to create an inside and an outside edge. And when we create those inside and outside edges, what we're really doing is we now have forms control over everything. At this point, I think that's probably about as far as I want to take it, but let's just note that we can continue manipulating this design by doing things like selecting loops, and we can move them around, or we can use scale and shrink them down a bit. And we can go back and forth between smooth and box display and just see what that looks like. So scale that down a little bit and go to smooth display. And you can see that this changes the shape and the intent and the look of the design. And so far it looks okay. I think I would spend a lot more time adding detail in these areas because that's not really realistic to a rim. We would probably just need more control around those faces. So potentially adding those edges on the backside would be a good thing. But again, I'm really not intending to carry this on to completion. It's just another aspect of designing with forms that I wanted to show. So let's go ahead and finish the form, convert it to a surface body, and now we have a surface body back in our typical design workspace. We're no longer in the contextual form environment. And we could do things like thicken this, or we could cap it off to make it a solid, or we could do that in the forms environment as well. But at this point, hopefully that was helpful in understanding a little bit more about how to do some hard type modeling with Fusion 360 Forms. Again, it's not a perfect workflow. It does take a lot of time. And my suggestion would be to use some of our techniques that we've learned with things like creating a surface extrude and then attaching your form body to it, because that would allow us to create a perfectly revolved cylinder or barrel for a rim. We could create the perfectly revolved center hub section, and then we could simply create some surfaces where we want those to attach. It could just be a hole in the side of the rim barrel surfaces, or it could actually be some sort of extension that we attach to the edge and use it to control tangency. But either way, it's fun to explore this type of modeling with forms because this is much harder for us to do in most cases, in a lot of cases, when we're trying to use a typical surfacing workflow. If you have any questions or want to see anything else along these lines, more hard type modeling, then please let me know. Maybe a more simple product we could explore and do a little bit more on. But this is as far as I'm going to take this basic rim shape, and hopefully you'll play around with it and see what you can create on your own. So if you end up making something, if you have problems, or if you just want to show it off, make sure that you leave a comment or send me an email, support@caducator.com, and I'm happy to take a look at it. As always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.